Looking for someone, I guess I'm doing that.
Well, I think with Trespass is that we kind of feel is really the first kind of proper Genesis album. The Genesis Revelation stuff was songs we'd kind of written with the original intention of other people doing them, and no one else would do them, and then we sort of modified them a bit so they fit this kind of broad concept we had, and then just recorded them while we almost just left school. Very simple. We never played live or anything, and we just I played mainly piano on it and stuff. By the time we did Trespass, we'd been playing on the road for a few months, and we had a whole, obviously about an hour and a half's worth of material, and we just recorded what we thought were the sort of better ones for Trespass.
From the beginning, we set out as songwriters, and we were sort of quite happy to be writing what were effectively pop songs. But I think there was always inside of us a yearning to explore, to push the boundaries, and to mix styles. And as we started to get a little more adventurous, it got too out of mainstream, left field for Jonathan and for the publisher that we were working with then, Joe Roncaroni. And so we sort of parted ways at that point. And at the same time, we were rehearsing and I think building an identity and a sound. And Trespass was really the first opportunity we had to make a real album where we felt we were in the driving seat, if you like. John Anthony was there as a producer, and he was a great sort of man for performance and getting the energy. But I think the style and the arrangements and the approach was all determined by us for the first time.
From Genesis to Revelation was kind of an album kind of embarked on in a very naive way, but with a huge amount of fun. But I think we always felt that we had a lot of say, despite Jonathan King obviously being the sort of head honcho. I don't think we sort of felt that we were not doing what we wanted to do. Conversely, with Trespass, I don't think we sort of felt suddenly kind of emancipated from some sort of odious yoke in a way, as if this is going to be completely different, because we had a producer, John Anthony. The material was very much dictated by what we'd done on the road. I think if I'm obviously speaking for myself, but I think I remember the feeling with the others that if we'd had more time, we would have actually gone back to some of the music that we'd jettisoned. Because, recorded music is different to live music, but the tendency then, having been on the road, the pressure of the schedule, was to do the music that you were touring with, particularly if it's complex, because there wasn't enough time to rehearse new stuff. And we jettisoned all this sort of, what you might call sort of more adult, progressive, from Genesis to Revelation acoustic music, because it had just died on the road.
I think in a way the Trespass album was our first album as a band, you know what I mean? Genesis to Revelation was really a bunch of kids in a holiday time, which is fine, and an amazing opportunity. But between that album and Trespass, we'd become a band. We'd done live concerts, we were on the road, we were gigging band, we'd played together, we'd done the Cottage era. And I think really it's a strange album in some ways. The first album we actually ever did, only album we actually did, where we played it live before we recorded it, which I wouldn't do again, funny enough. But it's the first album I think that we felt like a band.
I was 17 in 1967, and that was an amazing year to sort of be entering adulthood. I'd sneak out from school and go down to the Electric Garden in Covent Garden, it's this basement club, and you'd see all these oil projections on the wall, and it was third-year band, or all this psychedelia, really, that was just the Indica galleries. There was so much going on, IT and Oz magazines. There was this cultural explosion happening, and it was this sense that youth, for the very first time, was taking over the world, and hypnotizing, intoxicating, that every barrier was being smashed down. And so, in our small, little isolated cell, we definitely felt connected to that. I think me probably more than everybody else, but this sense of trying to do things in a new way, in a different way, and that was very important.
I think we were sort of influenced, obviously in the early days we were very influenced with the Beatles, Beach Boys, Kinks, all that sort of stuff, which produced, which is still sort of very, very influenced on us throughout our career. But by that time we'd heard groups like Family and the Procol Harum album, Shine On Brightly, and Salty Dog, and Fairport Convention, and the way they were doing things interested us. It just showed slightly different approaches. You weren't trying to write hit songs, trying to sort of make music sort of do a little bit more than that. And this appealed to us. And the idea of having a bit more room to breathe, songs creeping up to sort of 7-8 minutes, just seemed a lot more exciting to us. And the idea of being able to develop.
People often liken us to, we were in that era of sort of Yes, ELP and stuff, and actually they were very different as they are to us. You listen to Stagnation and those sort of songs, it's an acoustic album, We were always about songs and a bit of playing, but the playing sort of came secondary to the songs, I think.
Fairport Convention influence and the acoustic guitars was quite a big thing. And Phillips and Mike, used to play these two guitars together, and they do a lot of interweaving sort of parts and the harmonies they created between them, which was very much a sort of part of early Genesis, and strong part of it actually, and certainly led to the start of what was probably the best song on this album, which is Stagnation, I think. Which is starts off as an acoustic thing, which was a little idea of Mike and Ant's, and then it developed by the whole group into a sort of a bigger piece. But it was a very, I think that was quite unique. In fact, no one else really sort of was quite doing that, but it wasn't. It did come from that sort of Fairport sort of roots, I think.
There's a paradox here, you see, because Tony was more from the sort of classical side, but loved pop. Peter was probably heading more towards soul, but the guys that were into the heavy stuff was Mike and I, because we've been in the schoolboy bands, doing Stones, Kinks, and Beatles, and a lot of the heavier bands, and we were the ones that were writing the sort of really sort of third-rate kind of blues riffs and stuff. And we were much less sophisticated to start with. I think what sorted Mike and I out was going to the 12 strings and finding a bit of refinement there. But we were introducing, when we started with this experiment of playing live, we were introducing some very third rate. There was a song called Going Out to Get You, which we used to do, which had a pretty indifferent sort of kind of riffs. I loved all the heavy stuff. I don't think it's true to say that Peter was making us go in that direction. I think that Mike and I wanted to go down it, but it's a good thing we didn't early on, because we weren't very good at it, is the truth of it. When the sort of the songs were developed out of the more refined songs into a heavier element, then I think it had some originality. What Mike and I were bringing to start with was sort of late sort of Stones, kind of Paul Stones riffs and stuff.
The folk sound of it, I think, was definitely from Ant and Mike and this 12-string combination, and I think that was really quite innovative, and I loved it, and I think tried to encourage it from my point of view, because they do these things where they'd get a composite chord. I know this is getting technical here, but one guitar would be playing, one chord and another chord, and you'd read the final chord as a composite of the two. Very boring for most people, but the effect of that was to give us a sound that was, I think, quite unique. And early on, we had one local paper who described us as folk blues mystical. And we were trying always, I think, to sort of, whether it was church music or whatever the influence, whatever the passion, to try and blend it. Nowadays, that seems nothing special. Everyone takes whatever they want. But at that time, music was very segregated. And I remember sitting in some publisher's office, and I think it was a record company, and they were saying, no, you have to decide what you want to be, and then you're a folk group or you're a blues group or whatever. You can't try and cross all these borders and barriers. And, I feel that's what I've been doing my entire musical career, is trying to, whenever someone puts up a barrier, I try and find a way through it.
some of the songs there developed out of things that we'd written as in sort of the way we used to write, which was Ant and Mike writing together and Peter and I writing together. The Knife particularly was the thing Peter and I sort of put together, and then we kind of developed it in the studio. I'm looking for someone's like that as well. And then obviously things like Dusk and White Mountain on this album came more from the Ant and Mike side. Visions of Angels was a song that was left over from Genesis to Revelation, which we then developed and made a bit more of to make it into a big live song. So, I think we were starting to write as a group, but it's still some vestiges of the individual writing there. I mean, looking back on the album, I like, it's not, I think it was a pretty good, well, I call it first album, it's really a second album, I suppose, pretty good for where it comes in the thing. And I think Stagnation is great. And I'm probably looking for someone. The other songs on the album, don't quite do as much for me anymore as they once did, I mean, I always felt Dusk was a bit of a B track. It sounds okay. And White Mountain used to do that live, and that was quite nice live as well, quite atmospheric. But it was not, I don't think it's as strong as what was to come.
Because we'd played a song so long live, we went in the studio fairly inflexible. We'd found a sound, that's the way it stayed, you know what I mean? And it was in a way a little frustrating. The way we worked after that, we went in with the songs, having never played them live, so actually you could mess around with the sounds. You didn't quite know where you were going sonically. With that album, we defined how the parts went and the songs were. So in a way that was kind of a unique experience.
It was slightly more sophisticated recording than from Genesis to Revelation, but not a lot. 8-track, I think it was. Can't remember. I know that John Anthony wouldn't let anybody drop in. So I remember Mike had a bit of a classical guitar at the end of Stagnation about 6 minutes in. He had to sit there, listen to the whole track. And of course, by the time it got to this bit, he was so nervous that he fluffed it, and started again. So it wasn't that sophisticated. But there were more tracks. I was able to double track a guitar solo, which would have been on the Knife. Oh, what a giveaway! Which would have been unheard of, from Genesis to Revelation. There weren't the tracks. So yes, it was a bit more sophisticated, and it felt a bit more sort of big boys-ish up to a point.
It was a very rushed sort of thing. You went in there, you had a sort of day or two to do it, and it was quite quick thing. And I mean, I remember being quite nervous, really, doing. You didn't want to make any mistakes because, it wasn't the ability you have now of sort of going back and repairing and overdubbing and stuff. The whole band went in there and we all played it, and you went on and did a take until you got something that was halfway decent from all of you. Particularly the drums, because that was the one you really couldn't do anything about. Some of the other stuff you could, but it was. I just remember going in there and just playing the songs. But we were pretty well, we played them on the road, as I say, for a few months, and we were pretty much okay on them, I think, and we just played them pretty much as we'd done them on the road.
It was kind of pleasant because it wasn't too difficult because we knew exactly what we were going to do. It was nice sounds, nice crowd of people. John Anthony was really fun, very humorous, a lot of bad, filthy jokes and stuff all the time, which we were a bit sort of, but he was great, and so it was kind of, I think I just sort of coasted through it, really, to be honest. I went through it on autopilot, is the truth of it, actually. There were no arguments. There'd been so many arguments when we were writing. There was nothing to argue about, really, except the level of whether the organ was higher than the guitar or whatever. So, and John Anthony was in charge of that. So, no, it was pretty pleasant, to be honest. But, no, I mean, I think by that stage of it, I wouldn't say I definitely knew I was going, but I wouldn't say that I was really pretty much on autopilot, actually.
I could barely play bass on the first album. I mean, I wasn't much of a bass player. I'd been playing more guitar with Ant, and then, of course, obviously he's the lead player, so I had to play bass as well as acoustic guitar. I mean, I just think the initial period in Christmas Cottage, where we did that sort of 6 months in the country writing, that's when I felt the band formed as a proper unit. And so it made anything after that feel very different in a good way.
Here today, the red sky tells his tale, but the only listening eyes are mine.
Stagnation, that was a journey song, as I call it, that you didn't follow the normal verse, chorus sort of structures, but you went on through a series of landscapes, and I think right from the word go, that was something that interested me, and it continues to interest me in sort of stuff that I do. I mean, more often now with sort of film work than film soundtrack stuff, but I love that, and I think some of my favourite pieces of music are when I, as a listener, get taken into different worlds made out of sound, and if there are some things that you've not encountered before or blends that you haven't met before, then it pays off even better for me. So I think that's what we were aspiring to, and that's, I think, one of the tracks that did that, and I think that was probably one of the most band-composed tracks on the record.
The Stagnation developed out of a piece that we'd had rather pretentiously called The Movement, which we'd been rehearsing for sort of like for a long time before we played it on stage or anything. And it developed, this thing at one point was about 30 minutes long, and it sort of got condensed, and bits came and bits left. But the first bit stayed. So it was always a sort of key song for us.
It was really a sort of 2 12-string thing that Tony got in on very early, and it wasn't just right to say that, we did the sort of chordal basis and Tony just put solos on top. It was more than that. I think his sort of kind of cross rhythms and cross harmonies influenced the way that the 12-string harmony went. Again, it was fun because you had this feeling that maybe we're just going somewhere slightly differently to other people in a very natural way.
Peter used to play a lot of flute, really. It was nice for us to have an instrument. You must understand, those days, obviously, keyboards meant just organ and piano, really. That's all there was. And I sort of got a fuzz piano going, piano through a fuzz box, which got some good sounds on it. But the flute, which Peter played, was a very strong thing. And he wasn't a great flute player, and he would never say he was, but it was a lovely touch in there. And things like Stagnation, is the melodies, the big melody at the end, the sort of riff that carries on and on, starts off as a flute thing. And it's a really nice thing, and it was a really nice quality to have in there, I think. Obviously later, once the sort of mellotrons and everything came in and synthesizers, we sort of, it went by the wayside. But it was, it also gave Pete something else to do when we were writing songs. I mean, he didn't just sort of sing, we were banging tambourines and the rest of it. Obviously sometimes it gets a bit frustrating, I think, for him, because he was a person who'd like to have had his hands on the keys quite a lot of the time, but I wouldn't let him, So he could play the flute, and then that would be a nice way of writing it. It would give one a sort of another dimension to the sound.
I just hated the idea of being just the singer, that as soon as the lyrics, which never got heard much because bad PA systems in those days, stopped, you were left with nothing to do musically. So you either had to prance around or get off stage or stand still. Whereas I wanted to, I was full of music. I wanted to play something. Tony was extraordinarily possessive about the keyboard. Flute, I'd done a bit of at school. I always liked the sound, and a little bit of oboe. I was even worse oboe player, but it made a couple of good noises now and again. And then the bass drum was something physical, visceral, that I could kick hard. And occasionally it was in time. So that was important to me, to be in the noise-making department as well as the singing.
Stagnation to the Knife is a great example of what we do. The contrasts are always how we create our music, in a sense. And that album, starting with Stagnation and then having the knife on it, which is our heaviest song, and a popular live song too.
Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams. Light up your body with anger.
Well, The Knife was a very popular stage song. And we used to construct our set in those early days. One thing we used to start acoustic, and I used to play a lot of guitar. And it would start with the first 2 or 3 songs I'd play guitar on, and then with Stagnation would be the first sort of song that had anything else in it. Then of course that song itself develops, starts off with just the guitars, and then the keyboards come in, and there's even an organ solo, and then the whole thing becomes drums and everything come, and there's a big thing at the end. So, and then The Knife was the kind of final song in the set, and it always got the audience that they always loved it. It was that sort of the rhythm, it was just sort of always even people who weren't sort of quite sure what we were on about, they heard that and their heads were all going. So it was a key song for us in those early days, and it became very much, I think, for that first sort of year or two we were touring, the key song, the trademark Genesis song.
I'll give you the names of those who must kill, all must die with their children, carry the heads to the palace of old, hang them high, let the blood flow.
Well, the Knife used to be known as the Nice because we were big fans of the Nice, and I'd sat around. There was an energy. The Nice, people, not many people know much of their work nowadays, but it was what actually drew us into Tony Stratton Smith. And although, Keith Emerson was, associated with some of the sort of more extreme departures of prog rock on the keyboard, then it was a sort of hip underground band that Hendrix wanted to join. Now, people forget that, but they were amazing. It was powerful. It was sort of inventive, driving. I mean, maybe Soundgarden might be a sort of modern day, well, latter day reference. And obviously Emerson was a great performer. He used to sort of rock forward and back with the Knife. And I was thinking, and there we would be, sitting on stools, twiddling away at 12 strings, and you'd think, where's the balls in this? Let's get something with a bit of energy and a bit of something a little dangerous. So we didn't have anything like that, so I started to try and write something that would have that energy, and that's really how things began. And then Tony added a section to it, and obviously the keyboard thing at the end. But I think it was the first sort of peak of a darker energy that we discovered, if you like.
Standing in a forest, gazing.
That was a very early actual piano song from me, pre the first album, in fact. I mean, it was sort of in 1960, early in 68. I mean, I couldn't play the piano at all in a conventional way. I used to play with 3 fingers in my right hand, octaves there, and then I would cross over and play a tune there, which is very bizarre, and I think Tony thought I was an idiot, which would be understandable. But like a lot of idiots, sometimes you come up with something that's quite just a little bit different, and it has something, because I was helped by the fact that I was very limited. Sometimes too much skill isn't necessarily a good idea.
Visions of angels on a round, dance in the sky.
There was that sort of plodding sort of piano style that was very fashionable. Beach Boys had done it a lot. Beatles were doing it a lot. Things like with a little help from my friends, that sort of plod rhythm. And so, that fitted well with my octave, dun, dun, da, da, that kind of thing. Which the middle section with Tony's keyboard, the chords, and all that sort of glory that it gave, it made so much difference to it. And obviously, it was actually a song that was quite well suited to being dramatised a bit. Both vocally and in Peter's performance, and with the organ. So I'm sure if it had worked on Genesis to Revelation, we would never have done it. So in fact, that was a nice consolation for it not working out, because I remember at the time I was rather heartbroken, because it was definitely my flagship song from Genesis to Revelation, and it got chucked off. I didn't argue about it, but I didn't know it was ever going to see the light of day. So yeah, that was a really nice bonus, and that was one of the few, well, it was the only one from that previous era that survived.
Looking for someone,
I guess I'm doing that.
That was another one that was sort of, felt like a song which I'd brought to the band, and the band had then extended, and it was a sort of soul-influenced piece. But it then went into this sort of folkier journey, and I really was pleased with that mixture.
trying to find a needle in a haystack. Chilly wind, you're piercing like a dagger, it hurts me so. There.
It was fun to sing. I've always liked to try and have, in the different voices I work within, to have a bluesy one, and that was more sort of soul influenced.
In peaceful shades of green.
Our relationship, obviously, with Peter was a very close friend of mine at school, and Ant and Mike were the same, and then we sort of coming together there. And obviously on this album we had John Mayhew as the drummer, who was the person who was actually our third drummer. Someone we picked up really through through ads and stuff and everything, and we were sort of slowly getting some cohesion going, I think, between the five of us in that way. It was quite difficult for John, I think, because we'd all been to the public school and behaved a certain kind of way, I think, which must have been very irritating to him, I'd have thought.
It was the summer of many drummers, many adverts, many auditions, people being picked up from stations, skullduggery, cloak and dagger stuff, who's going to tell him and all that sort of stuff. It was awful, absolutely awful, because we loved John Silver, and John Silver decided to pack it up and go to the States for university. He didn't want to, give it a go. John Mayhew was older than this. He was more experienced, but I think it was from a different background, and he was very unsure of himself with us. And I think we tried to do our best in our own rather lame way to make him feel comfortable, but I'm not sure we ever did. And he was a good drummer, but we were very demanding, very, very demanding. And I think he always felt he came up short. He didn't really. He did a fine job. The trouble is that history hasn't treated John well, because his successor happens just to have been one of the very, very special drummers. He not only was a drummer but a singer and all the rest of it. Brilliant musician. So I think, had they found a sort of more prosaic drummer afterwards, then history would speak more kindly about John. But he's cast in a rather dim light, which I always think is rather unfair. I think that we were pushing boundaries and trying to do this and probably being very demanding. And we'd spoken the same musical language. We'd grown up in the same environment for a long time. There's no way John could really understand what these toffs were on about most of the time. And I think he did a pretty decent job. It just wasn't clearly quite good enough.
We were used to sort of having this passive-aggressive tone to the rehearsals, because although Tony and I were best friends, we would be at loggerheads very often about the music.
It was very close, but we used to fight an awful lot, terrible arguments and shouting matches and going off. I was probably the main instigator of that kind of stuff.
He was then a lot more nervous and not at ease within himself. He would try and, in a tight way, hold on to controlling as much as he could in a lot of ways. And I would always want to push it wide open and, let the sunlight in and the rain and see what grew. And Ant and Mike, for the most part, got on pretty well, and occasionally, I would be in battling out with one of them, but Mike tended to avoid confrontation. And then, later years, Phil and Steve would avoid the confrontation. But I think, Tony and I were the most frequently at odds.
We argued a lot because we were passionate. Also, we were young, sexually frustrated. I don't know, all sorts of reasons we were. It was just one of those things. We did feel intensely about it, really, and you find yourself, you look back on some of the arguments you had were just about sort of pretty trivial things. But when you're close to people like that and you're living on top of each other, little things can trigger an argument. Which is about nothing at all. And that's first, the cottage period when we were just all living together, and we weren't even hardly taking weekends off or anything. It was quite a strain on those people who did actually have relationships. So it was kind of, it was difficult, but it was intense. But it had some great moments there too, and I remember it, being as a sort of mixed period, really, some great moments and some violent moments.
No, we were passionate, without question, about getting something great. But I think, we were both awkward buggers, difficult sorts. So it was some of that personality as well.
It was a difficult period. There were some great moments and some awful moments, to be honest, during the writing period of this and everything. But then once we started playing on the road, it got a bit, once you started some audience response, it all started to sort of, make sense a little bit, really.
My parents, bless them, are supportive. I mean, if you see your children really keen to do something, I think you have to support it. I'm sure they're hoping it wouldn't last, or I'll grow out of it. But because in all fairness, in those days, as parents, there was no possible conception that you could have a career making this kind of music, pop music. They hadn't really seen that. And so, in a sense, supporting, I think that they were very good and very brave in that way, I think.
There was parental pressure, and in fact, John Silver, who'd been the drummer after Chris Stewart, and is a wonderful guy, and had, as was Chris, but John had actually been very good at encouraging us to develop sort of an individual personality and to push the sort of the folk thing. I mean, he was a sort of jazz fan, really, in lots of ways, and he dropped out definitely because of parental pressure, and he ended up, at Cornell University in America, and he said afterwards he was sort of still hoping he'd get the letter welcoming him or inviting him back, whereas we just thought, okay, well, that's what he's decided to do. Fair enough, he's off. And with John was much more of a professional musician who'd actually played with real bands of musicians rather than a bunch of songwriters, pretending to be a group. And so he had sort of different sets of experiences, and I think he was having a difficult period in that time, and he worked really hard and was very dedicated and delivered, I think, well in some places, but it still felt a bit of a struggle. Just on the drum side of it, I mean, Ant was the other person who was also drum sensitive, so I think he and I sort of overlapped in some of those areas, but between us, we would have a lot of ideas for what the drum parts should do, in much the same way that I think, Paul McCartney did with Ringo. And obviously as soon as Phil came along, that role was unnecessary.
I went to university for a year, in fact, and then sort of took a year off and then took another year off. And I think my parents always hoped I'd go back. And I knew that I felt this was an opportunity that would only come. It wasn't that you get opportunities, it was one that was there. And I thought about not doing it, and then I thought I really would miss this. I really, really want to do this as a chance, and at that time it was an incredibly slim chance, as you must understand. And so we just sort of slowly, we were able to do it. I think back in that period of time, 1970, there were an awful lot of clubs and things you could play where a band like us could just play support probably to some other group, in front of maybe 80, 90 people, maybe less or less, when we headlined, we were playing to sort of, sometimes a little sort of 5 or 6 people. I mean, that's what you were doing, but you had a chance to learn your craft, and you could actually, you just about could get enough money to keep yourself going.
Many people have been puzzled how the hell we did so well and how the hell we survived for so long, when in a lot of critics' eyes, the music is unlistenable. So, and I actually think that it's because it's based on songwriters, and obviously we built a very strong fan base playing live, and I think it was those two things. But if you look at, say, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, 10cc, other bands which are songwriter-based rather than musician-based, I think you do see sort of long lifespans, maybe, or not all in the same direction, but it's a different sensibility. Most bands begin, playing together and then find writing, whereas we wanted to write and we found playing.
Dawn saw the white mountain deemed red.
People never realised that in a way, I think, apart from Peter, who was always very get up and go with agents and managers and the business side, in many ways that first era, Ant was the strongest driving force. Extrovert on stage, musically he was very strong, I think. So the concept that he might leave was probably nowhere near in our thoughts at all.
In many ways, Ant was the most musically gifted, I think, of all of us, and it was, I think, a great loss when he didn't sort of continue on beyond that. I mean, it was he was also the most obsessive, I think, in a lot of ways, and some of that culture, I think grew quite unhealthy. That a life was not a concept that the band would sort of consider or allow beyond what we were doing. It was a bit like joining the army. And it wasn't really from an authoritarian sort of point of view. There was just this really powerful group mentality that it had to be 100% total commitment. And, that, I think, also has its cost. And although I think Ant was very uncomfortable playing live, and that was part of it, but it was also, I think, extremely stressful. And in part, it was self-imposed and then group-imposed stress.
Anthony, for me, was kind of the group leader. He was the one who wanted to go live. He was the one who wanted to go professional. He kind of motivated the rest of us really to do that. Peter and I were not sure at all that's what we really wanted to do, but he was the one who wanted to do it. And initially, I think we almost stayed. The first summer we started doing this. We did it because we were a four, and we sort of did it before with the intention that we probably wouldn't stay and they would find somebody else, And then, of course, we got more into it and everything after that. So we were very surprised, then Anthony was the one who sort of seemed to suffer from stage fright and everything, and that kind of, in a sense, was sort of perhaps ultimately the reason why he left. But there was no feeling that he was going to leave at this point. So it was a very sort of difficult thing. And I mean, at this point, we were very definitely looking ahead, for that this was the group.
Well, that was nothing to do with the music. It was just to do with the sort of stage fright and sort of things that just health, really. I just had kind of, found it really tough. I'd started well and then come unstuck, really. That's why I was saying, on the album I was pretty much sort of on autopilot because these things had already happened. So the recording, in a sense, was quite pleasant for me because there was no sort of huge pressure. Because I'd sort of internally put myself under huge pressure on the road. I mean, you might have thought that being in Trident Studios was a huge, but I didn't sort of see it that way. It was kind of very pleasant. No, that was all to do. It wasn't. There was nothing. There was no sort of kind of left for musical differences or huge personality clashes. No, I just found the touring just had taken a huge kind of toll, really.
I'm conscious now, having just finished this book we've done, and hearing his side of things, I was kind of saddened that I didn't quite clock what was going on. We were very close, Ant and I, and I think at this stage I had a girlfriend and we saw each other less, and I kind of drifted away a bit, and I wasn't really aware just quite how bad his stage fright was, and he had glandular fever. I know he was run down and everything, but I didn't quite. I'd have thought that I'd know him so well, I would have really been able to get picked up what was going on, but I often miss things. But I didn't. So in a sense, it was a shock when he told us. In those days, for the first 2 or 3 albums, we had Paul Whitehead, who was a good artist who kind of, at the time, was involved in doing album covers and stuff. And so you kind of, and also there's that nice gatefold sleeve you don't have anymore. So you kind of let him go. I mean, you let someone go away and do something quite that excites them, and then see what you got. And he looked great with the big sort of knife slash across, I thought.
Well, that was quite a nice idea. We saw the music we'd done. A lot of it was very sort of pretty and romantic music. We had this one song, The Knife, which was anything but, a sort of violent song. So we just pictorially did that. We said to this guy, just draw a fairy drawing and then knife slash through the middle with a knife sticking out the end of it. And that was sort of, I think it's quite good really, because it's deceptive, Genesis, sometimes. You sort of see them as one thing, but in fact there's this other thing going on right from the early days, I think. And we've always had those two sides to us, sort of, it may vary a little bit really as to how you define them, but the sort of romantic side and the sort of more aggressive side, it's a very important part of what we do. And so I thought that particular cover actually was really good because it was, it was supposed to be a kind of like a cliched sort of fairy story kind of like cover, and then with this knife on it, which did something special, I think. Best of the early covers, I think, in many ways. Well, best of the first 3 covers, anyhow.
We talked to Paul at some length, and he heard some of this sort of folky stuff and mythical bits, and I just felt it was getting too twee, so I suggested that we get a big knife and slash it, which fortunately, there was a lot of discussion about this in the band, but in the end, they went for it. And whereas I was going to go for quite a crude knife, I think Paul in the end chose this sort of more elegant dagger, which wasn't quite what I'd had in mind, but I think it did a job, and for fans, so I had again its own personality, which is what we wanted.
I think it seemed to be a pretty good compromise between the kind of folky sort of tendency towards slightly sort of medieval echoes of, and then there's the sort of harder edge stuff. So, and you want to draw someone's attention as well. So a great way of combining it is you've got one thing which is the sort of the characters plus this knife slash, which might look a bit OTT and grotesque to some people, but it seems to me to be a pretty good reflection. And you can see commercially why that was a good move.
Well, Trespass was a big advance for us from Genesis Revelation. We'd been playing live for a while, and I think it was the first album where we start to play as a group. We actually know what we're doing, and everything sort of starts to coalesce. Really, it's in its position in the Genesis thing, it was very important. It was a kind of because it set the trend, I think, of what was to come later. It's definitely the first of the Genesis albums as people came to know them, and from that point of view, it's very important. I think we still had a bit to learn, and I think one or two of the songs in there, perhaps a little bit slight in comparison with what was to come later. But at its strongest moments, which I said before, I think Stagnation, I think it's right up there.
I think it was a good start. There was definitely a personality that was different to other bands and prog bands at the time. So it was the first thing, I think, to set us apart. And we had, I think some minor success in Belgium, which felt like conquering the world at the time.
I would think it's sort of a very good early Genesis album. Obviously, there's many better later.
I'd describe it as our first album as a proper band. That's how it felt. We'd become a band and made an album. We haven't heard it for 30 years, 20 years, so actually you go back and you kind of often reevaluate and go, well, that's really quite nice.